Hey everyone, I'm Cosmic and welcome to the Cloud. So, we finally got some news for Splatoon Raiders. And unlike the reveal teaser, this trailer is dense with information to unpack. My overall impressions are very positive. The gameplay seems really solid and the visuals are fantastic. However, there are some things I have mixed feelings on, as well as a few worries, so let's get into it. Now, I am really excited for this game, but first and foremost, there's one thing I am not quite sure how to feel about. Salmonids. I honestly did not expect them to show up in this game, and I have to say, my gut reaction is a twinge of disappointment. This is gonna be a bit of a rant, but I promise I'll get back to the actual trailer. The Splatoon series has, in my opinion, a bad habit of reusing enemies. In a narrative sense, this can sometimes lead to cohesive world building, as the conflicts between groups of people persist across multiple games. In other cases, not so much. Octo Expansion actually handled its reuse of enemies pretty well. The sanitized Octarians are probably one of the most defensible palette swaps ever, with tons of lore and story context to justify their return. But the biggest criticism of Splatoon 2's base story is that it largely just felt like Splatoon 1 again, with the reused Octarian enemies and antagonist being a large reason why. In Splatoon 3, this was arguably even worse, as not only did the fuzzy Octarians feel comparatively lazy and underdeveloped after Octo Expansion, but their capture and use by the story's villain was barely even explained. But what about the Salmonids? Well, they've appeared in 2 mainline games, and this makes sense, because the conflict between them and the Inklings has only intensified as time has gone on. It makes sense until you beat Splatoon 3's story mode, and then you have Deep Cut doing ad reads on their podcast for the guy who tried to commit a global genocide. You have the main character, who is friends with a Salmonid, taking no issue killing other Salmonids. You can see how this creates some problems. So yeah, my first impression is that I'm not thrilled to see Salmonids again. Gameplay-wise, we have already been shown a decent number of brand new enemy types, so I don't want to come off as too harsh, but this is something I will probably continue to have mixed feelings on. It's especially odd to see so many boss Salmonids returning completely unchanged. It might have been cool for both the lore and gameplay if these Spiralite Salmonids had never made contact with the Octarians, meaning they wouldn't have access to things like shields for scrappers or hover tech for Salmonids. But that's evidently not the case. And the biggest concern I have about the Salmonids is how or if the story will address the very questionable treatment they've received from the Inklings in the past 2 games. Splatoon's developers have stated that they don't view the Inklings as the good guys and other species as evil. The conflicts in Splatoon's world arise when different groups of people with clashing values and interest come into contact. However, the Salmonids very often get the short end of the stick. Especially after the entirety of Splatoon 3, it's hard to argue they're on equal footing with the Inklings. They're maybe close in terms of military strength, but certainly not morality. The Salmonids are described as a warlike race, but I think people forget that the Inklings are too. Their favorite pastime is to kill each other for sport. Of course, death has a different context here due to their ability to respawn, but they're still characterized by their aggressiveness and violence. The Inklings invade Salmonid territory and take their resources by force, while the Salmonids fight for spiritual fulfillment. The Inklings gamify and commodify the slaughter of their enemies. Historically, the Salmonids are said to have toppled Inkling cities, so some level of self-defense is warranted, but Grizzco is a corporation defined by greed. The entire idea of Salmon Run is that you're working for a shady company who's probably using its wealth as the means to some nefarious end. In fact, we know that is the case. We saw the guy, we killed him. My point is, while Splatoon has used gray morality as a part of its stories from the very beginning, it was a lot more obvious that the Octarians were their own group of people, with the game showing them in a more and more sympathetic light up to the point where we played as one, completely shifting our perspective. Octo Expansion doesn't focus on condemning the Inklings, though notably it does do that, but it plainly suggests that it would be better for everyone if the Inklings and Octarians could simply get along, which works to recontextualize the stories of Splatoon 1 and 2. Splatoon 2's Sunken Scrolls, the Salmonid Field Guide, visual details on the Salmon Run stages, and statements from the developers have repeatedly suggested that these Salmonids are sapient people with their own culture and values. However, this is yet to actually be acknowledged by a single character in a Splatoon story. And as time has gone on, they seem to be depicted more and more as simply savage animals or even pets. I like the idea that the Inklings aren't perfect, and I don't want all of the conflict in Splatoon's world to be resolved overnight. I think these clashes in ideals lead to a more interesting world with more to say. But it's getting to a point where the dehumanization of the Salmonids by the story's characters, alongside lore that repeatedly humanizes them, is getting a little uncomfortable. Once again, in Splatoon Raiders, you could argue some of this violence is in self-defense, but stealing Salmonid artifacts? Raiding the Spiralite Islands? If we're meant to be playing as morally gray characters, then the Salmonids need to be more of a threat, or the protagonists need to stop being so terrible to them, because right now the balance feels off. Of course, either of those things could happen. I don't want to be all doom and gloom about this. Based on what we've seen, I don't know what the lore of this game could be about if not the Salmonids. I'm sure we'll get some kind of explanation for what's going on here. But until we do, I'm going to be a bit apprehensive about how the conflict will be handled and how this story will end. At the very least, it's time for the games to acknowledge that this kind of relationship between the people of Splatoon's world is a lot more one-sided than the Inklings might think. This was a hope many of us had for Splatoon 3 or 4, but I'd go as far to say it's a requirement for Raiders. But okay, with that out of the way, what's actually going on in this trailer? In terms of story presentation, there is unfortunately very little to work with. We do get some fun animations for the mechanic, which I am really happy to see. In the short time we've known them, they're already way more expressive than Neo Agent 3, and I absolutely love their design. Deep Cut seems to mostly be their usual selves from Splatoon 3, with Fry using her eels and Shiver bringing along Master Mega. This shot of Shiver talking to the mechanic is also really cute, and while I'm still doubtful the mechanic will speak, this does at least suggest some kind of dynamic between them and Deep Cut, so that has me excited. And for the record, I'm pretty sure this speak button during the customization sequence is just to test out what the character sounds like when hovering over your selected species and appearance. I don't think we can actually change which voice applies to which body type. It's a nice idea since they've decided to remove the defined gender labels, but it isn't really a new feature. Next, we have the setting. The Spiralite Islands seem to be full-on Salmonid territory, distinct from the areas in Salmon Run where Inkling and Salmonid interest overlapped. There are tons of food-related sculptures, as customary for the Salmonids, as well as large statues that look like salt grinders. In fact, salt seems to be the central motif of this area and its inhabitants. The island's titular spiralite crystals look like salt, and the Salmonids have varying amount of salt on their bodies. Speaking of the Salmonids, these don't look like the typical fish we're used to. I've seen a number of theories about why this might be, some more compelling than others. First, I've seen multiple people already claiming this game takes place in the past or involves time travel. I even got a comment confidently calling the game a prequel, and I don't think there's any implication of that. Nintendo described the new Salmonids as a local variety. There's nothing here to suggest that these are ancient Salmonids or that the characters have traveled to the past or something. I assume most of this speculation is based on Team Past winning Grand Festival, but I personally expect any consequences of that to be saved for Splatoon 4. Next, in their recent Tumblr post, Rassicus brought up that Splatoon 2 and 3's Salmonids were said to all be the same species, despite the names of different variants referencing multiple real-world species. While the Salmonids around the shores of Encadia and the Splatlands are meant to look like evolved chum salmon, it's possible that the Spiralite Salmonids are based on sockeye salmon, which would explain their red coloring. Another idea Rassicus presented is that these Salmonids are spawned out. That is, after completing their spawning cycle, their bodies have begun to deteriorate, like real-life salmon. This would make the detail of them being covered in salt quite interesting. Salt is obviously famous for being able to preserve meat, so covering themselves in salt may be a kind of way to preserve a Salmonid's life after spawning. This is currently the idea I find the most interesting, though it may limit how much agency the Salmonids have in the story if they're half dead. Spawned out salmon are even sometimes called zombie salmon, which would align with the aesthetics of Salmonid gameplay, where enemies attack in hordes like zombies. It's also worth noting that Spiralite may have already been shown to possess strange properties beyond normal salt. When the mechanic jumps off the robot in this clip, you can see what appear to be Spiralite crystal shards floating underneath them, allowing them to slowly glide rather than falling normally. There's also a blue particle effect that appears when the mechanic charges up the Splatchet, which we know is crafted in part with the crystals. This doesn't tie directly into the preservation theory, but it does suggest that Spiralite contains some kind of power that can be tapped into. For my money, preservation theory is probably the best guess we have for now, but again, I really do hope we get some demonstration of Salmonid intelligence, rather than all of them just being mindless monsters. Also, calling it right now, these guys will be called Salty Salmonids. Very creative, I know, but it just feels right. We could read even further into this. The Salmonids, preserving life, preserving the past, versus Deep Cut, associated with the future, stealing ancient artifacts, using high-tech weaponry. There's a lot of potential with this dynamic, and I really hope the developers manage to get something meaningful out of it. I have worries about this game's story, but I'm already very intrigued by this setting and the lore implications it may bring. I think I'll leave it there for now, though. Let's move on to the thing the trailer actually focuses on: gameplay. To begin, let's quickly cover everything we know. This one menu tells us a lot about what the game will entail. It appears that the player will have a main weapon, such as the Splattershot, Junior, Octobrush, and Mini Splatling we have seen so far. Interestingly, weapons in this game appear to have a level. More on that later. You can also equip up to 2 gadgets, which are bound to L and R. So far, we've seen a turret that is placed down and fired automatically, a Splatchet, which attacks similar to a Decavitator Splatana, though with much greater range, and this little device that spawns a spinning ring of projectiles around the player that damage enemies. A few more gadgets were teased on the Splatoon Twitter account, with some of them resembling existing sub-weapons from the mainline games. Each gadget can be tinkered with, allowing the player to add modifiers and bonus effects. There's also a feature called Relic Powers. These seem to be abilities granted upon collecting certain pieces of treasure, such as the two-fisted Salmonid we see with a mid-air jump ability. The icon for this power is different than the one we see equipped in the menu, which has a spiral icon. What that one does is anyone's guess. Next is ink tank customization. It isn't clear what all of the effects of changing your tank might be. It seems that some relic powers will be limited to certain tanks, while others, like the mid-air jump, can be used on any tank. We see 3 different tanks used in the trailer, with one of them being the water pouch design from Splatoon 3. I would guess that they each have differing levels of ink efficiency and possibly refill rates, along with facilitating or limiting certain relic power builds. There's also a little charm hanging from the ink tank, which, as far as I can tell, seems to correspond to which member of Deep Cut you currently have as your bot buddy. Or, in other words, which one controls the robot that accompanies you in combat. In some clips, the charm appears to be glowing, which I imagine is there to signify when Shiver, Fry, or Big Man are ready to use their special attacks. We see 2 of these moves in the trailer, riding on top of Big Man and using him to attack, and sending Shiver forward on Master Mega. It's unclear if there's any other advantage to choosing one bot buddy over the others. It would be cool if they had different fighting styles, since we see that they do attack passively with the bot's gun, but I can't really tell from the footage we have. Last on the menu is style. We see the mechanic wearing a number of outfits throughout the trailer, and these might just be cosmetic. It seems like they come as a complete set, rather than the shirt, pants, and shoes being separate, and there's no headgear shown at all. Honestly, I'm okay with that. There's already a lot to keep track of without clothing abilities on top of it all. In the top right corner, we see the option to swap between 3 different pages, likely meaning we will be able to save a number of tank, gadget, relic, and buddy builds to swap between. It could be 1 build per main weapon, 1 build per Deep Cut member, or something else. The large raft we see in both trailers seems to be called the Hideout Ship. It looks like we can customize the ship, likely adding new features or decorations. In one shot, we can see an arcade cabinet behind Deep Cut, which is likely one of these upgrades. It could just be cosmetic, but it would be pretty cool if we could actually play minigames on it, like the cabinet in Splatoon 1. The Hideout Ship seems to act as a hub area, where we can craft new gadgets and hang out with Deep Cut before using this massive crane to launch ourselves out on an expedition. Once we're properly in the field, most of the gameplay seems to consist of fighting Salmonids. Along with their own weapons and gadgets, the player can summon the robot with a command, likely up on the D-pad, similar to calling small fry. This causes it to jump into the air, dive back down, and ink the area around its landing. This also repositions the bot so that it can effectively fire at Salmonids using its gun. Once it's close by, it looks like you can also jump off the bot, boosting yourself into the air. The overall structure of the game isn't entirely clear from the trailer, but in terms of objectives, it looks like the bot can be used to scan the area for treasure, causing it to place several beacons on points of interest. These seem to include treasure chests containing relics, spiralite deposits, which drop spiralite crystals used for crafting gadgets, and dungeons. What are dungeons? Well, we aren't quite sure. There's a separate menu for them on the map screen, but we never get to see it in the trailer. The main assumption I've seen from others in the community is that dungeons are the arenas we see that appear to be underground. These are likely to contain more focused and difficult challenges with more significant rewards. Some additional gameplay was posted on the Twitter account, showing what appears to be a dungeon in a volcanic-themed area surrounded by lava. The terrain here is notably more video gamey, in line with what we're used to seeing in Splatoon levels. Beyond that, though, it isn't super clear how dungeon gameplay differs from the gameplay on the surface. And that's about everything we know. There are some tiny details I didn't cover, like all of the gadget perks we see, but you could pretty much pause and read those yourself. So how am I feeling about all of this? Generally, really good. I have loved the idea of getting another secondary ability in Splatoon for a long time, and it seems like there's going to be a good amount of variety in gadget types and combinations. The amount of playstyle customization here is very compelling, and it seems like a massive improvement over Side Orders upgrades, which mostly consisted of stat boosts, but not actually new ways to play the game. Swapping between 3 weapons or tools at any given time, including more passive abilities, seems like a perfect way to add depth to Splatoon's combat without overcomplicating it. As stated earlier, I do have some concerns about the reuse of boss Salmonids. I don't really love that we're still fighting enemies that borrow assets from Splatoon 2 specials in 2026. Some of them are enhanced, like this stinger that appears to be shooting 3 stingrays at once from different pots, but even that feels more like something you would see in a DLC rather than a brand new game. I am generally trying to reserve judgment on this front. I do think the combat customization will be enough to make this game feel very fresh and different, but Splatoon needs some new enemy types, and not just 2 or 3, but a lot of them. One way they might be shaking things up is the purpose of combat in the first place. Interestingly, it seems like these Salmonids don't aggro onto the player until they come within a certain range. And none of the enemies we see in the trailer drop golden eggs. These may be Salmonids, but the game is clearly not just $50 salmon run. With that said, one question that comes to mind is, what is the incentive for engaging with enemies? Well, we can make a few pretty solid guesses. As stated earlier, we can see in the menu that main weapons actually have a level. It's possible that splatting Salmonids will grant you EXP that makes your weapon stronger. Additionally, enemies drop materials, such as this scrapper window, which can be used alongside spiralite crystals for crafting. This RPG-style progression seems like it will be pretty important, since each area on the map has its own Salmonid level, suggesting that the variety and strength of the enemies will increase throughout the game. Additionally, some or maybe all of the dungeons will probably require you to splat enemies to clear them, and I'm sure the treasure in the overworld will be guarded closely by Salmonid forces. With all of that said, I don't imagine the entire game is just about combat and treasure. One thing that I personally hope to see, that we unfortunately have not seen much suggestion of so far, is platforming. I really love Splatoon's movement, and the existence of a mid-air jump does have me excited, but everything we've seen so far is very combat heavy. Not only that, but the islands we've seen are exclusively flat arenas. After the focus on combat in Side Order, I was really hoping to get some more classic obstacle course style missions in this game. I acknowledge that it's very difficult to make lengthy levels with interesting movement while also adhering to this more naturalistic art direction, but the few times we've gotten something close to that are pretty much my favorite moments in Splatoon. I'm hopeful that at the very least some of the dungeons will play out like classic Splatoon levels, while taking advantage of the new abilities and movement options introduced in this game. If nothing else, it seems like it would be a nice palate cleanser between all of the fighting. But like I said, there's currently no sign of it. And for now, that's pretty much all I have to say. Nintendo has been posting more information about the game every day on Twitter since the trailer, and I'm sure we'll learn more about the story as we get closer to release, but these are my immediate thoughts on Splatoon Raiders lore and gameplay based on a 2-minute trailer. I am so happy that we are finally getting news about this game, and I can't wait to see what Nintendo does with it. For now, I'd love to hear what you guys have to say in the comments. Thanks for watching, this has been Cosmic, farewell.